Welcome once again, my fellow manipulators of Digital Fate. I'm Richie, this is Capricorn, and this is the third video in my set review series for Outlaws of Thunder Junction. In this video, we're going to cover all of the black cards that are legal for standard, both in the base set and in the big score bonus sheet. There are a couple other bonus sheets that are not standard legal. We'll probably cover those in a separate video down the line, but everything in this video is black for standard legal cards. Also, I'm going to link in the description links to the other set review videos that are out, so check those out when you're done with this one. Make sure you get caught up on all of the cards. Also, if you wouldn't mind hitting the like button, that really helps me out a lot. It makes sure this video goes out to way more people, and they take a lot of time and energy to make, so I would greatly appreciate that. Subscribe if you're new, because I have a ton more content. I have a ton more content coming, tons of cool deck techs that we're going to hit the ground running with on launch day. Lots of cool stuff. So do that, do the thing, let's get on with it. First up, we have Ambush Gigapede. This is 2 black and 4 for a 6/2 insect with flash. When it enters the battlefield, target creature an opponent controls gets -2/-2 until end of turn. Nice little combat trick here. It is a bit expensive. It's not an outlaw, so it doesn't help any of those sort of archetypes. 6 mana for a flash creature that's a 6/2. Not bad, because you can flash it in combat, block their thing in trade, even if their thing is big, and then maybe kill something else with the ETB, or maybe make the other thing small enough that you don't die, although it would have to have 3 power at most in order for that to work, if you were to then block with the Gigapede and not die. Overall, I feel like this is super expensive. I feel like this is kind of filler. It's almost like a removal spell that might, under very rare circumstances, leave behind a body. But usually you're just going to use it to trade at instant speed in combat. So if you're really light on removal spells in your deck in Limited, maybe play this. That being said, you want to pick it up pretty late in the pack, because it's definitely going to table. Next up, we have Binding Negotiation, 1 black and 1 for a sorcery. Target opponent reveals their hand. You may choose a non-land card from it. If you do, they discard it. Otherwise, you may put a face-up exiled card they own into their graveyard. I kind of love this. This is actually much better than strict discard. Like, you can just be a pilfer. You know, do the 2 mana, make them discard whatever non-land thing they're about to play on curve that's going to give you the most advantage. But there's extra value to be had here in being able to hit a plot card. And that's where it gets really good, because they have to pay the mana for the plot card up front so that they can play it for free the next turn. So if they take their turn and they plot a card, they spend like all of their mana on turn 4 plotting a 4 mana card that they're going to play for free next turn. You can then on your next turn just play this for 2 and make them exile the plotted card. So not only did you discard something hugely impactful, but you also made them waste the mana to plot it. And that makes it better than strict discard. It almost makes it seem a little bit like a counterspell in a way. It's almost like discard anything from their hand or counter a plot spell. Because you, just like a counterspell, you force them to have to pay the mana and commit the mana, and they still don't get the thing. So the fact that you get that upside on a card that can already just on rate make them discard anything from their hand for 2 mana if you need to, makes this card a little bit better than most discard spells we've seen, I think, at this mana cost. So I really like this card. I think it's really a high pick in Limited, because plot's going to be everywhere. So I recommend grabbing one pretty early on. Definitely not like a super early pick like in the first few picks, but definitely in the first half of the pack. Next up, we have Black Snag Buzzard. 1 black and 2 for a 2/1 bird with flying. When he enters the battlefield, he enters with a +1/+1 counter on it if a creature died this turn. And then you can plot him for 1 black and 1. So not only do you get a little cost reduction if you plan ahead and plot him, but you can also make sure that you play him on a turn where you are sure that something's going to die so that you can get that counter. So 2 mana to set you up to get a free 3/2 flyer in a later turn. You know, when you play it for free after playing like a removal spell or whatever, is actually pretty good. Can come down at a key point in the game where you need evasion to like get in for a few swings and close out the game. So I actually really like this card. It's one of the better commons, I think. I recommend grabbing one. Not super early, but you'll probably include it in your Limited deck. Next up, we have Blood Hustler. 1 black and 1 for a 1/1 Vampire Rogue. Whenever you commit a crime, you put a +1/+1 counter on Blood Hustler, but this ability triggers only once each turn. He also has an activated ability for 4 mana. You can make target opponent lose 1 life and gain 1 life, and you can activate that as many times as you want as long as you have the mana to do it. So that's kind of interesting, you know. You could use something like Training Grounds to make that ability activate for only 2 mana, which is pretty cool. But all in all, I don't quite think this card is good enough for standard play, for any kind of constructed play. In limited, it's going to be pretty cool. It's a nice way to fill your curve with something that's going to get bigger over time if you're fully committed to committing crimes. There's a lot of commit a crime synergy in this set, so this is the kind of card where if you're already going into an archetype where you have better payoffs for committing a crime that you're already trying to enable, this is some really good support payoff, where since you're already trying to do that as much as possible, you can get some extra value here, and in that situation, this can become relatively big, quick enough for it to matter, and then give you a nice mana sink later on. So nice filler grab later in a pack for that kind of deck that's in that archetype. Next up, we have Boneyard Desecrator. 1 black and 3 for a 3/4 with Menace. You can pay 2 and sacrifice another creature to put a +1/+1 counter on Boneyard Desecrator, and if an outlaw was sacrificed this way, you get to create a treasure token. So this guy's really good in Outlaw Tribal, I think. You're definitely going to want one if you're in black and you're going deep into Outlaws. A 3/4 Menace for 4 is already pretty decent, but it just gets bigger as you sack creatures, and there are mercenary tokens, which are a big thing in this set, so the chances of having some guys that are worth more as sacrifice fodder than as being a creature is decently high, and the fact that when you sack Outlaws, you get treasure tokens to mana fix you for your splash color, to ramp you into some big bomby play. I just think this guy is great. If you're not super deep into Outlaws, he's just kind of like an okay card that you're probably still gonna want to pick decently well, and you're probably still gonna want to play. But if you are deep into Outlaw Tribal, he's a very high pick. He might be the highest common pick for limited. Next up, we have Costic Bronco, one of my favorite cards. 2 mana for a 2/2 Snake Horse Mount. It has Saddle 3, which is a decent amount of power you need to saddle it. You need to tap creatures with power totaling 3 or more to saddle it. But you don't need to saddle it for it to just be a creature. It can still attack and block like normal without being saddled. But when it does attack, you get to reveal the top card of your library, put it into your hand. You lose life equal to that card's mana value if you didn't saddle the Bronco. But if you did, your opponent loses that much life. So there's a lot to kind of unpack here. Like, the fact that you don't need to saddle it in order to get card advantage and to draw cards and for it to kind of be a Dark Confidant is huge. Like, you still have the ability to get card advantage over time. It's just going to cost you life. But the fact that if you saddle this, it gets way, way better. Not only do you not lose the life, but then you also make the opponent lose the life. If you end up drawing like a 5-drop or a 6-drop, that is huge damage. Even if they block this thing in trade, sometimes it's still worth it. Sometimes it's even worth it if they just block it and eat it up and don't trade with it, right? But what's cool too about Saddle 3 is you can play this with other mount creatures, and when you have circumstances correct to be able to swing in and not lose your Bronco, you can do that. You can saddle this thing up and you can get your card advantage and do some crazy stuff. But if you're in a situation where you can't swing with it the way you want because you're going to lose it in combat and you're not ready to do that, you could always just use it to saddle another creature. And that's kind of what I love about this. I love the idea of Mount Tribal. I've said it before in some of my other set review videos and in the spoiler breakdown videos I did when they initially dropped. Like, Mount Tribal could be a real thing. If you have a Roaming Throne down, or an Isshin down, or a Delny down, all of them allow this ability to double trigger, which seems kind of crazy to me. So we could go Mount Tribal with Roaming Throne, or we could just do crazy Mardu mounts. They all have attack triggers, so we could play things like Isshin and Delny and get double or maybe triple under the right circumstances triggers. I think that could be crazy. So either one of those decks, either Mount Tribal or just Mardu, crazy attack trigger stuff if that happens to use a decent amount of mounts, the Bronco included. I think both of those could be really cool decks, and we're going to explore them both as soon as the set's out. I think this card is awesome. Not quite good enough to be one of the best, my picks for one of the best, but very high up there. I think it's a lot better than most people are giving it credit for. Next up, we have Consuming Ashes, 2 black and 2 for an instant that exiles any creature if it had mana value 3 or less. And then you Surveil 2. So, 4 mana instant speed exile anything is already pretty decent for common removal. You gotta remember, this is common. It's gonna be very easy to pick this up later in the draft. It's probably gonna table. There's a lot more removal lately since they switched to play boosters available for limited, so it's super easy to get this late. And being able to pick up something like this late where add instant speed and you exile it for 4 mana, granted it's a little bit expensive, but it's pretty on rate for common removal, right? So the fact that it's also instant and it exiles is pretty decent, but if you have to hit something that costs less than what you're paying for the Consuming Ashes, it's nice that you get a little bit of extra value here. You get to Surveil 2, dig 2 cards deeper to get to your bomb, which is super crucial and limited. So I think this is an easy, like, I need more cards, you know, 22nd, 23rd card to fill out the deck. Easy slam dunk to fill out the deck and make your limited deck that much better. Next up, we have Corrupted Conviction. 1 black for an instant. As an additional cost to cast this spell, you sack a creature, and then you draw 2 cards. So, this is basically Village Rites. It's great. You're going to play it. It's especially good in this limited format because we do have a token theme going with the mercenary tokens. So there is a better chance that you're going to have fodder that's better to sacrifice to this than just an entire creature card, if that makes sense. So some nice card draw here. If you're in any kind of archetype that wants stuff in the graveyard, this can be a little bit better too. Next up, we have Desert's Dew. 1 black and 1 for an instant. Target creature gets -2/-2 until end of turn, but it gets an additional -1/-1 for each desert you control. This is another one of those desert cards payoff. It's looking like it's probably a Golgari based deck for the Deserts Matter archetype. I still don't know if a desert deck is good enough to be a thing in Constructed, in Standard. It might be. We've seen a few payoffs. If there are a couple more really good payoffs, it's possible that that could be a thing. But in Limited, it's absolutely a thing. And if you're already going there, you slam dunk this and it's going to be great. This is easily going to be 2 mana removal that can hit almost any creature if you're deep into deserts. And there's an archetype for that in Limited. So if you're doing the thing, you've already got some of the green payoffs. It makes perfect sense to go Golgari, add this in, and really make that deck sing. Next up, we have Desperate Bloodseeker. 1 black and 1 for a 2/2 vampire with lifelink. When he enters the battlefield, target player mills 2 cards. Now, what's important to note about that ability is don't read it as target player mills 2 cards. Read it as when he enters the battlefield, you get to commit a crime. Because that's where it's actually going to be most useful. And I think some of these abilities that target things that aren't doing anything super good, like just milling here, are way better as ways to enable committing crimes, and that's way more likely to be overlooked by a lot of you guys going into your first drafts. So keep that in mind. If you're in the deck that has really good committing a crime payoffs and you're trying to get as many enablers as possible for that, this is a way to enable that while also having a body to commit to the board and add more pressure. Not only that, but it's a lifelinking body, and lifelinking is way better in Limited than people realize a lot of the time. It's much better in Limited than it is in Constructed, because a lot of times it comes down to a war of attrition and a race you against your opponent, and being able to pad out your life and extend that clock just matters so much. So I actually think this guy is really good common. You're probably going to want to run him, especially if you're trying to commit crimes. That's where he really sings. Next up, Fake Your Own Death. We see this card in, I don't know, a lot of sets. There's a version of this in pretty much every set, right? 1 black and 1 for an instant. Until end of turn, target creature gets +2/+0 and gains whenever this creature dies, return it to the battlefield tapped under its owner's control. and you create a treasure token. So the big upside to this one is you get a treasure token. So not only do you trade with their thing that's bigger than your thing, because you're giving it extra power to make sure it can, but you're getting your thing back, and you're getting a treasure token to fix you for your splash color, to ramp you to that big drop you want to play next turn. This just does a lot. I think this is one of the better versions of a spell like this we've seen in a while. Treasure token is just always useful. It's not conditionally useful. And some of the things, the payoffs that we've seen for spells like this in the past have been conditionally useful. So I think this card in particular is a little bit of a leg up on some of those other cards. That being said, it's going to be a lot better in a deck that needs the fixing, and it's going to be even better in a deck that really wants stuff to die. If you're in some kind of a sacrifice archetype, this is going to be much better. Next up, we have Forsaken Miner, 1 black for a 2/2 skeleton rogue that can't block. Whenever you commit a crime, you may pay 1 black. If you do, return it from your graveyard to the battlefield. This guy's just awesome. Not only is he a skeleton, so maybe he can go into skeleton tribal in standard, because I'm hell-bent on making that a thing, no pun intended. He's also a rogue, so he fits into like outlaw super tribal, and that's just crazy to me. I feel like there's got to be a home for a 2/2 1 mana outlaw, right? With all the outlaw synergies. He's going to be really good in limited, although you can't block, so you have to be in a very aggressive deck where you're constantly swinging and trying to just lessen that clock to as little as possible and just finish the game as quick as possible. Because if you get on your back foot and you have to defend against the opponent and he can't block, that's very detrimental. So you have to be in a super aggressive deck to run him in limited. But that being said, if you are, he can just come back again and again. Like, committing a crime, I've said this a bunch of times already, but committing a crime is so easy to do. Like, a lot of the things you just want to do anyway, like kill their creatures, are just going to incidentally count as committing a crime. So it's one of those hoops that's a lot easier to enable than most. And so getting to just, when you're doing that for your other commit a crime payoffs, and because you just need to kill a thing or whatever, you just incidentally get to just pay an extra mana and get this guy back onto the field to keep applying even more pressure. That's just a lot of value. So if you're in the outlaw deck, as long as you're super aggressive and you're trying to like really put them on a clock and race them, I think this guy is a very high pick for that deck. But if you're in any kind of a deck at all that's trying to drag out the game a little bit until you can get some evasive creatures in play to win with, or, you know, just take control of the board or whatever the case may be, you don't want this guy. He's going to be detrimental to that kind of a build. Next up, we have my pick for the best card in black, Ghisa the Hellraiser. 2 black and 3 for a 4/4 legendary human warlock. Has ward 2 and pay 2 life, is skeleton and zombie tribal, and not only buffs them like a normal lord, +1/+1, but also gives them menace. And it doesn't stop there. Whenever you commit a crime, you get to make not 1, but 2 2/2 blue and black zombie rogue creature tokens. And granted, this ability triggers only once each turn, but if you can commit crimes at instant speed, you can do it on your turn and on their turn. So you have the potential of getting 4 2/2 tokens every turn cycle, just doing the things you normally want to do, like casting spot removal on their best creature or whatever. That seems insane to me. And then when you take into account the fact that they're not really 2/2s, because Geese is a lord, they're 3/3s with menace. So you have the potential to make 4 3/3s with menace every turn cycle. That's just insane. And then you look at the ward cost, because the one weakness that she has is the fact that if they kill her on curve, they can prevent you from getting your value, and then they probably pay less mana for their removal spell than what you paid for her, and then they get a tempo advantage, right? That's usually the downside of any kind of 5-drop that doesn't give you either immediate value or whatever. But because of the ward, it means if they want to kill Ghisa, they have to pay at least around the same amount of mana that you paid to cast her. So like, best case scenario, they're out of removal. By the time you play her, they can't deal with her, and you're just going to steamroll them and win very quickly. If you could just keep her out for a couple turns, like, that's the game, right? Worst case scenario, maybe they do have removal left, but it's like you're paying 5 mana for her, and then they probably are paying 5 mana and 2 life to get rid of her, and you actually manage to do a little bit of damage and just equally kind of trade as far as tempo because of the mana that you each spent. So I love a lot of these creatures that are 5-drops that are having like Ward 2, Ward 3 on them as a way to make them more playable without having ETB effects, because it puts you on level ground with the removal that your opponent's running. And so I think that makes this card really, really good. Deceptively good, way better than all of the people that are shouting from the rooftops about how this is just going to die to removal before you get to use it, because if it does, with the ward, it's kind of fine. It's not what you want, but you're not down on tempo, right? You're not down on card advantage or anything like that. It just balances out, which is really nice. And if you can manage to stick it, man, this thing's just going to put in so much work. So this is an automatic first pick in Limited, and this is absolutely going to see constructed play. And if you think it isn't, you are out of your mind. It's my pick for the best card in black. Next up, we have Grevious Gambit. This is not the best card in black. 1 black and 3 for an enchantment. When it enters the battlefield, you draw 3 cards, gain 6 life, and create 3 2/1 black bat creature tokens with flying. That is a lot of value for 4 mana. The downside is when it leaves the battlefield, you discard those 3 cards, you lose that 6 life, and you have to sacrifice 3 creatures to make up for the 3 that you got. So you're at a net gain of 0, which is really, really bad. And what's even worse is if you just leave it on the battlefield forever, at the beginning of your end step, you have to discard a card, lose 2 life, and sack a creature. So over the course of 3 turns, you've already lost at your end steps all of the value you gained, and then you continue to lose value, and if you get rid of it, you lose even more value. So it's very detrimental and hard to use, and because it leaving the battlefield just takes everything it gave back, it's really hard to kind of like break this card and find really good ways to use it. That being said, there are a couple specific ways that we can actually make this card work to great effect if things line up just right. The first is a little bit easier to pull off, and that's just finding ways of duplicating triggers. So if you have something like Elesh Norn, which is going to double your ETBs, and then you play this, you're going to get, 6 tokens, 12 life, draw 6 cards. So it's not as big a deal that you have those downsides because you got way more off of it right off the bat, right? The other way of really taking advantage of a card like this is to donate it to your opponent. Now, it's unfortunate that you can't use, I forget the name of the card, 4 mana black card that allows you to give them a creature. You can't give them an enchantment, so unfortunately you can't use this with that. But you can't, I think it's Fateful something? I don't remember, I think it's something with an F. Let me know in the comments if you remember the name of that card. But you can use this with Coveted Falcon from the last set, where, when you pay its disguise cost and you unmask it and turn it face up, you get to donate stuff to your opponent. You can give them the Grevious Gambit, and then you don't have to worry about any of the downside. That seems awesome. And there's a card in this set that does that as well, called Shifting Grift. We'll get to that when we get to the blue cards. But one of the modes of that, being a spree spell, is it allows you to trade an enchantment for an enchantment. So if they have any enchantment at all, you can steal their enchantment, give them the Grevious Gambit. And both of those slot in really well into a Dimir deck with this. So is it too cute to actually be worth it? I don't know. We're going to have to test it. But I have to admit, the idea of giving this to the opponent is awesome. So I have to at least try it. And if we can make it work consistently, could be a hell of a deck. So very interesting card. We'll see if we can get there. We're moving on. Harvester of Misery. This is another card that was in contention for one of the best cards of the set. And it's just so good in such an elegant way. 2 black and 3 for a 5/4 spirit with Menace. When it enters the battlefield, other creatures get -2/-2 until end of turn. And then you can pay 1 black and 1 and discard it to give any creature -2/-2 until end of turn. This is so good. This is another way of putting a 5-drop in your deck for something like Trumpeting Carnosaur to hit with Discover 5 and get out as a big creature with a good ETB. But also a way to have that in the deck, but also have 2 mana removal. You can get both in the same card slot, which is what makes it good. Not only that, but the removal is used by discarding the card, which means it can't be countered because it's not casting a spell. So it's removal that's a lot harder to stop, which is really, really nice. But just getting rid of all of their small guys with the -2/-2 when you play this, just on ETB, and then even if they have one big creature that survives it, the menace means you're able to get around it. So the keyword ability really synergizes with its ETB ability really well, and it's just a good card. Like a 5-mana 5/4 menace that is going to kill stuff when it enters the battlefield. It's just really good. It's just really good. Even without the discard thing, it's pretty good. But having this extra mode, like I said, being able to slot it in with Trumpeting Carnosaur, being able to play it in something like, I don't know, maybe an Invasion of Alara deck that you don't want to play anything that costs 4 or less other than the stuff that you really want to hit with Invasion of Alara. This is another thing you could play with that combo if it ended up being worth it. So lots of cool stuff you can do. It's just a really, really solid card. Slam dunk and limited, obviously. I'd be surprised if it didn't show up somewhere in Constructed. Next up, we have Hollow Marauder. 1 black and 6 for a 4/2 Spectre Rogue that costs 1 less to cast for each creature card in your graveyard. It has flying, and when Hollow Marauder enters the battlefield, any number of target opponents each discard a card. For each of those opponents who didn't discard a card with mana value 4 or greater, you draw a card. Most of the time, they're not going to discard something that costs 4 or more. So most of the time, this is going to be a 4/2 flying body, they discard a card, and you draw a card, which is crazy. Granted, 7 mana is a lot, but this costs 1 less for each creature in your graveyard, and that's decently available to you even in just a normal creature deck in Limited, right? You can expect over the course of the game to get 2, 3, maybe 4 creatures in the graveyard, and just on curve be able to play this for like 3 mana, pretty easily without even really having to jump through a whole lot of hoops. But obviously, if you're in the deck that's trying to fill up your graveyard, that's trying to enable things with like Surveil or whatever, this just gets way better. If you can dump a bunch of stuff in your graveyard really quick and just play this for 1 mana, that's insane. A 4/2 flyer for 1 mana that's a 3/1 is nutty. This might slot into the Insidious Roots deck just as extra value, right? Just because you're filling up your yard with creatures so much. It's just a lot. There's definitely got to be a deck that wants to use it. There's got to be a constructed deck that at least wants to try it. Whether or not it makes the final cut, I'm not sure. In Limited, it's going to be a high pick. It's an evasive creature that can win you the game, that has built-in card advantage. You just have to make sure you're in a creature-heavy deck, but most of the time you are in Limited. Obviously, it goes way up in value if you're in a deck that can specifically fill up the graveyard with creatures. If you're trying to do that already, it's going to be a much, much higher pick. But even without that, I think it's a solid middle of the ground pick that you want to grab in the middle of your pack and not let pass. Yeah, you don't want to expect to try to grab this too late, because I don't expect it to table very often. And with that said, man, these videos are long. Give me a break. A coffee break. Nectar of the Gods. Sweet nectar. Where were we? Hostile Investigator. This is actually my pick for the sleeper card for black in this set. The most underestimated card, if you will. Everyone that sees this card just thinks it looks like an overcosted burglar rat. But there's so much more going on here that's easy to overlook. So this is a 4/3 Ogre Rogue Detective for 1 black and 3. When it enters the battlefield, target opponent discards a card, and whenever 1 or more players discard 1 or more cards, you investigate, but this ability triggers only once each turn. So a lot of red hoops to jump through there, but what you need to understand about this first and foremost is that the floor of this card, the absolute minimum that you get out of it, is a 4/3 body for 4 which is decently on rate. No, it's not above rate. It's not anything crazy for 4, but it's giving you your mana's worth for sure. It can trade effectively. It can swing in for damage effectively. It is not nothing, and that is a crucial part of this card. So it is a 4/3 body for 4, which is a substantial piece of board presence. Also, they discard a card no matter what, and you immediately make a clue token from them discarding that card no matter what. So at the bare minimum, you have an automatic 3-for-1 here. They lose a card, you get a clue token to draw a card later, and you have a 4/3 body for your 4 mana, which is plenty worth it. So just at its floor right there, it's a pretty good card. If you can build a deck where you're able to take more advantage of the different parts of this card, it gets even better. So if you're able to keep it alive and make them discard even more cards in subsequent turns, you can get even more clue tokens, and it just starts to snowball value. Also, if you have ways of discarding your own stuff for value, you get the extra benefit of also creating a clue token. Sometimes that gives you the ability to make a clue token on your opponent's turn by discarding something of your own during their turn, because it's really hard to find discard spells that you can use at instant speed that you can hit the opponent with, but you can do things like channel a 𝐵𝑒𝑠𝑖𝑔𝑒, and it counts as a discard, and if you do that on your opponent's turn to destroy an enchantment or something, it's also going to trigger the investigator and give you another clue token, even if you made them discard a card from their hand with a sorcery speed spell that you cast on your own turn. So in that way, you can sometimes get 2 clue tokens every turn cycle if you're very careful with how you play it, and that's pretty effective. But this also lines up really well with Braids, in a Braids sort of sacrifice deck, because not only can you play some of the enchantments, we already have a 1 mana enchantment. I forget the name of it off the top of my head. If you remember, comment below. But it's a 1 mana enchantment that makes the opponent discard a card and also hits them for 2 damage. We already have that, which is really good with Braids because you can sack it to Braids, but now it's got extra value in that if you play it after you have Hostile Investigator out, it's also going to trigger the Investigator and create you a clue token. And then whenever they discard and you make these clue tokens, you can use them to sacrifice to Braids instead of just using them as clues. So everything kind of layers on top of each other as synergies. There's also a new enchantment in this set that we'll get to in a little bit that fits really well into that. So I think if you build around it correctly, this card is awesome. Even if you don't build around it correctly, an automatic 3-for-1 is pretty good. It's not going to take over the world. It's no Shieldred or whatever. But you got to remember, you got to respect the card because at the very least, it's an automatic 3-for-1. And that's got to be at least good, right? It has to be. Next up, we have Insatiable Avarice. 1 black mana for a sorcery with Spree. For an extra 2 black mana, target player draws 3 cards and loses 3 life. That's insane in and of itself. 3 mana, draw 3. Granted, it has to be all 3 black mana, so you have to be very heavily into black. And you lose 3 life, which is not nothing. But still, 3 mana to draw 3 in black is nuts. That's one of the best on-rate draw spells we've got for black in a very long time. But then not only that, you also have this other Spree ability of 2 colorless mana. You get to search your library for any card, shuffle, and put that card on top. So if you happen to top deck this later in the game, when you don't have as many things to play and you have extra mana to play with, not only are you drawing 3 cards, but you can also pay the extra and draw 2 and basically tutor anything from your graveyard into your hand in addition to the 2. Because you're putting 1 on top and then drawing that 1 and then drawing the other 2. So it's really good on rate card draw that can also be even more than that later in the game and tutor for your thing. And then if you're really desperate, you can always just use it as just a tutor, right? If it's turn 3, your opponent's playing Boros Convoke and they're going super wide and you absolutely need your sweeper no matter what, you could just play this for 3, find your 4 mana sweeper, put it on the top of your library. Next turn you draw it, play your 4th land and sweep the board. Like, so having that as a plan B to a really, really good plan A of drawing 3 for 3 mana, and then the potential of doing both of them if it's later in the game and you have the extra mana, just insane. Just completely, it's just really good. It's just really good. You're going to play it. Next up, we have 𝐻𝐒𝐕𝐈𝐻 the Punisher. This is actually my pick for runner-up almost the best card in black. Second place, this is 2 black and 1 for a 3/3 legendary human warlock. Whenever you commit a crime, you exile up to 1 target black card from your graveyard and copy it. You may cast the copy, but if you do, you lose 2 life. This guy is super good in ways that are easy to overlook. First of all, he feels like Leer. He kind of feels like Leer on crack. He's 3 mana instead of 5 like Leer, so he's like Leer for 2 less mana. And he can hit things that aren't just instants and sorceries, right? He allows you to replay any black card from your graveyard, which is kind of bananas. But it gets even better when you realize that it's really easy to turn this on. To commit a crime is most of the stuff that you want to do, you're going to be committing a crime anyway, right? Use any targeted removal, it's committing a crime. So you can do some really cool things like commit a crime by removing a dude, and then that spell that you use to kill them goes to your graveyard. So what you can do is the next time you commit a crime, you recast that spell, which lets you recommit another crime, which lets you cast another spell. So not only are you able to play things from your graveyard by committing crimes, but you're able to play things from the graveyard that themselves are going to commit crimes and allow you to play even more things from the graveyard. So you could snowball, which is why I think it makes you lose 2 life every time you do it as like a checks and balance. But there are ways around that for sure. Sometimes you can just win with overwhelming value before your life gets low enough. Other times you can maybe play this in a deck with life gain, something like Sheoldred. It's kind of gnarly with Sheoldred, right? Because they kill your Sheoldred. If they only have enough mana or enough spells to kill one thing, they kill your Sheoldred, leave the 𝐻𝐒𝐕𝐈𝐻𝐿 out. On your next turn, you could just cut down whatever dude you need to on their side and have 4 mana left over to just recast Sheoldred from the graveyard with 𝐻𝐒𝐕𝐻𝐿. That seems crazy, right? And then the life that you're losing isn't as bad because you're going to make back a bunch of life with Sheoldred. So there's just a lot of ways that this guy can snowball. I'm really excited to explore the potential. Especially when you coincide this with like a lot of the other cards that give you value off of committing crimes. If you're layering those synergies on top of each other, and every time you commit a crime, you're not only getting 𝐻𝐒𝐕𝐻𝐿, but you're getting X, Y, and Z as well, it can get really crazy and out of hand. So it's going to be really fun to explore where we can go with that archetype in Standard, and I'm looking forward to that greatly. So yeah, look forward to that deck. But this is my pick for runner-up, almost the best card in black. Next up, we have Lively Dirge. This is 1 black and 1 for a sorcery with Spree. For an extra 2 mana, you return up to 2 creature cards with total mana value 4 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. That alone is kind of insane. And I'll get to why in just a second. But for 1 extra mana, you search your library for a card, put it into your graveyard, and then shuffle. So let's talk about the second ability first, the +2 mana ability. It's basically Collected Company on crack. As long as you can actually put the stuff in your graveyard. The one downside this has to Collected Company is Collected Company doesn't have to jump through hoops to set up the creatures you can get with it, right? It just grabs stuff off the top however many cards of your deck. Whereas this, it can only grab stuff from your graveyard. So you do have to sort of set it up. But if it does get set up properly, being able to take 2 4-drops and put them onto the battlefield for a total of 4 mana is much, much better than Collected Company getting back 2 3-drops for 4 mana, right? So the potential for this to be much better is there. It just requires a little bit more setup. But that being said, for just 1 extra mana, if you do have the extra mana, you get to search your library for any card and put it into your graveyard. That means not only can you get back something from your graveyard that costs 4, you can also get back anything that you search out from your library, your best 4-drop, dump in the graveyard and get that back for just 1 extra mana. So the versatility there is kind of insane. And when you think about how you can use this with Sheoldred, like Sheoldred has a target on her, right? She's always dying when she comes out. So being able to get her back onto the battlefield for the same amount of mana it would cost you to play a Sheoldred, but also get another 4-drop is kind of gnarly. So I think this card is going to see play in conjunction with that in decks that are using strong 4-drops like Sheoldred. and maybe having like a couple of one-off silver tutor targets that are 4-drops for the right scenario to complement your Sheoldred, so you do have a second thing to hit. I think it's going to see play. I think it's really good. I don't necessarily think it's going to set the world on fire, but I'd be very surprised if people weren't at least running this on launch day, trying to find ways to make it work, because it can be a lot of value. It can sometimes be better under the right circumstances than Collected Company. Collected Company that can find a Sheoldred is nothing to scoff at. Next up, we have Mourning Surprise. 1 black and 1 for a sorcery. Return up to 1 target creature card from your graveyard to your hand, and create a 1/1 red mercenary creature token that can tap to give any creature +1/+0 at sorcery speed. I think this card is great for a common. Usually the one downside of cards that can return like a creature from your graveyard to your hand is the fact that they don't impact the board in any way, so you almost have to take a turn off or half a turn off when playing a card like that, and sometimes you can't afford the tempo loss. But a card like this, not only is it somewhat cheap at only 2 mana to get back your best creature, your bomb creature or whatever in draft to your hand, but it's also going to give you a little bit of board presence, and that's just enough to really kind of shore up and mitigate the problematic parts of other cards like this in sets past. You get to impact the board. Not only is it a 1/1 token, it's a 1/1 token with a relevant ability. So I think that makes this card a lot better. The combination of it just being 2 mana and it giving you something on the board for potential, for, you know, board presence, I think it's pretty good. It's better than most of the commons. So I would pick this relatively high for a common. It's still not going to be a very high pick overall, because there's going to be a lot of great uncommons to choose from. But higher than you would expect, I think I would take this. Next up, we have Neutralize the Guards. This is 1 black and 2 for an instant. Creatures target opponent controls get -1/-1 until end of turn, and you surveil 2. This is very simple, and it's actually much better than it looks on the surface. We're used to abilities like this being sorcery speed. So the fact that this is instant speed and it only hits your opponent's creatures means it's a really effective combat trick. It's a board-wide combat trick that at the very least is gonna be a mini fog, but is also going to allow some of your creatures to kill some of their creatures in situations where they otherwise wouldn't, and it's going to allow some of your creatures that are blocking to survive combat in situations where otherwise they wouldn't. So you can do a lot you can do a lot with this and get a lot of value if you line it up just right, because of the instant speed and because it doesn't hit your creatures at all. But you add the Surveil 2 in, and it's actually really effective because, especially in Limited, you want to get to your bomb as quick as possible. Like, chances are if you get to your bomb before your opponent, you're probably going to win. And Surveiling 2, really at the end of the day, the main part of that matters is the fact that you're digging 2 cards deeper, getting two whole turns. In the case of two cards deeper, 2 whole turns deeper, closer to your bomb. And that's really important in Limited. So if you can just dig and get there and get to your bomb, sometimes you can win. So being able to do that on the back of this really cool instant speed combat trick that doesn't hit your opponents, I actually like this card a fair amount. It's still not going to be an insanely high pick. It is somewhat situational, but I still would pick this relatively high. Next up, we have Nazumi Linkbreaker. 1 black for a 1/1 Rat Warlock. When it dies, it gives you a 1/1 red mercenary token that can tap to give +1 attack to any creature as sorcery speed. At sorcery speed? As a sorcery, at sorcery speed. Whatever. You know what I mean. But I like this card a lot as a common. A 1/1 for 1 that replaces itself with an even better creature. And it's important to note that both creatures, the one you start with and the one you end up with when it dies, count as outlaws. So this is a really, really good 1-drop for Outlaw Tribal. It really just helps ensure that you constantly have outlaws on the field. And it's just a lot of value for 1 mana. So as far as the commons go, I'd take this pretty high among the commons. Next up, we have Overzealous Muscle. 1 black and 4 for a 5/4 Ogre Mercenary. Whenever you commit a crime during your turn, Overzealous Muscle gains indestructible until end of turn. This guy's going to be kind of wild in just the right deck. If you're able to commit a crime consistently, if you're in that deck that's committing a lot of crimes consistently because you already have other payoffs for that, this is just gravy, man. You definitely grab this much higher than you would otherwise. Free indestructible every time you commit a crime, if you already want to just be committing crimes all the time anyway, is going to be nuts. And the body's on rate. 5-4 for 5 is fine. It's not going to be a high pick. This is going to table. It's going to come back to you, right? But if you're in that deck that's committing a lot of crimes and able to commit crimes consistently, this can just help you close out the game. Indestructible potentially every turn off of committing a crime is pretty gnarly. So, not a high pick, but one that you should absolutely keep in mind if you're going into that archetype for sure. Next up, we have Pitiless Carnage. That's 1 black and 3 for a sorcery. Sack any number of permanents you control, and then draw that many cards. It also plots for 2 black and 1. So not only do you save a little bit of mana if you plot it, but you're able to set it off into exile and wait until you have more things that you want to sacrifice. So you can go wide with a bunch of stuff, and then when those creatures aren't good enough to, you know, stand toe-to-toe with what the opponent's doing, you can just sack all the crappy ones. Anything that's not good enough to compare to what they're doing to meet the potential of what they have on the board, and then draw a bunch more cards so that you can play, you know, draw into bombier stuff and play better stuff that can help you take over the board states. So that alone is pretty good, but if you're using this in like a sacrifice tribal deck where you want to sacrifice things, where you're able to go wide with a ton of tokens, it can be even crazier. Part of me thinks that maybe like a Mardu Convoke deck could be a thing instead of just Boros Convoke. And a lot of times the Boros Convoke deck can have like 5 creatures by the end of turn 2, right? So the potential to just sacrifice so many creatures later in the game, so many 1/1s after you've gotten your value off of them and swung with them or whatever, to just draw a ton of cards and then just completely go ham by making exponentially even more creatures with all the cards you just drew, seems kind of wild. So I think potentially a Mardu version of Boros Convoke could exist, but at the very least, any kind of like sacrifice tribal that's trying to go wide is going to love this card. Will it see play? We'll have to wait and see. Next up, we have Rakish Crew. This is actually my pick for my favorite card in black for this set, and it's an uncommon, which is kind of funny. This is 1 black and 2 for an enchantment. When it enters the battlefield, you create a 1/1 red mercenary creature token that can tap to give any creature +1/+0 until end of turn at sorcery speed. But then this enchantment just sits on the battlefield, and whenever an outlaw you control dies, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. So this is basically Bastion of Remembrance, if anybody remembers that card, which is super good in any kind of sacrifice tribal aristocrats deck. So at that as a base is really good. The downside is you have to be deep into outlaws. You can only play outlaws and trigger this with outlaws. But the upside is the creature that you get alongside this is much better than the creature you get with Bastion of Remembrance, because you have this extra ability tacked on where you can give something +1/+0. So is it actually better than Bastion of Remembrance? Probably not. There's probably some creatures you would rather be sacrificing with this out to trigger it that you can't because they're not outlaws. But that being said, I'm super excited to try to brew a new aristocrat style build with something like this in Outlaw Tribal and just see how far we can take it. I think it's going to be super fun. One of my favorite decks that I've ever made in Standard, which is now not Standard legal, I now use it in Explorer, is like a Starving Artist deck. It's a Golgari sort of aristocrats deck that uses Bastion of Remembrance, and I'm excited to just try and make something similar in Standard that's deep into Outlaw Tribal. We'll see if we can do it. I just kind of love this card. I love these effects. I love the idea of going wide with a bunch of creatures with something like this out as a failsafe so that your opponent can't really wipe the board without dying because you have enough creatures that you're going to kill him or come close to killing him. That being said, Sunfall exists, so my dreams will probably be squashed, and I will be sad. Someone get rid of that card, please. It is not fun. Next up, we have Rattleback Apothecary, along with my itchy nose. Dude, allergies are wild right now, so I apologize. But, yeah, the nose itches. This is Rattleback Apothecary, 1 black and 2 for a 3/2 Gorgon Warlock with Death Touch. Whenever you commit a crime, target creature you control gains your choice of Menace or Lifelink until end of turn. So this is another one of those nice support cards in that deck that's trying to commit crimes all the time, where it's a pretty good body in and of itself, right? 3 mana for a 3/2 Death Toucher is pretty fine. It counts as an outlaw, so it slots into Outlaw Tribal. And then when you just incidentally commit crimes by using your removal or whatever, you're going to get to give something Menace or Lifelink for free, just cuz, for funsies. I think that's really good in Limited. I don't think this is quite good enough to see Constructed play. It's not really fast enough for aggro. It doesn't have enough staying power for mid-range. But in Limited, this is going to be a slam dunk. This is going to do so many things that you want to do. You're going to want to pick it high. Next up, we have Raven of Fel Omens. 1/2 for 1 black and 1. It's a bird with flying. Whenever you commit a crime, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life, but this ability triggers only once each turn. I don't really love this card. I think this is probably the least interesting card we've seen so far, even considering the fact that it's a common, you know? It just doesn't do a whole lot. The body's not great. It can block a mercenary if the mercenary doesn't get pumped up by another mercenary. Like, most flyers in this set seem like they have 2 power or more, so the 1/2 body doesn't feel like it does that much. And the fact that the life gain trigger can only trigger once a turn is just really depressing. If this could not be limited to once a turn, it would actually be really good. Like, the potential to just sort of combo a bunch of crimes in a row and just drain a bunch of life would be super sick. But limited to once a turn, this ain't it, guys. This ain't it. Pass. Next up, we have Rictus Robber, 1 black and 3 for a 4/3 zombie rogue. You can plot it for 1 black and 2, so you save a little bit of mana there. And when it enters the battlefield, if a creature died this turn, you make a 2/2 blue and black zombie rogue creature token. Alright, so, itch the nose. Allergies done. Check. Need some more coffee. I know I already had my coffee break, but throw me a bone, okay? I think this card is pretty good. I mean, you make sure you don't play it until something dies, right? You swing in, they block something and kill it, trade with it maybe. Then you get to play this and get a 4/3 and a 2/2 for your 4 mana. That's going to be insane in Limited, especially because it's also an outlaw and it's a zombie. So it's going to work with, like, Gisa, because of the zombie tribal. It's going to work with all of your outlaw tribal stuff. And it's going to give you 6/5 worth of power and toughness for 4 mana spread across 2 bodies. But as if that wasn't enough, if you don't have something to play earlier, you could just plot this for 3 mana and let it sit in exile until a turn finally happens where something does die. And then you get to play this for free and make sure that you get your 2/2. Being able to line things up like that, like plot this out, and then on your next turn, use your mana to play your removal spell, and then cast this for free to make sure that you get your 2/2. Some really cool lines you can do, and I think it's going to be really effective in Limited. I just think this is great in Limited. It's a lot of value, and the plot gives it some versatility. So pick it high. Not like a first pick or anything like that, but relatively high pick if you know that you're in black. Next up, we have Rooftop Assassin. Talking about high picks, I think this is actually one of the best commons in black. It doesn't look like it on the surface. It looks like it's filler, but trust me, this is a 2/2 vampire assassin with flash, flying, and lifelink for 1 black and 3. When it enters the battlefield, you can destroy any creature an opponent controls that was dealt damage this turn. The important part of this card and why it's so good is the flash. Because the flash means that you can chump block with a 1/1 and then kill their biggest guy that you chumped with it, right? Because you're going to deal 1 damage with your 1/1 and then flash this into play, destroy any creature an opponent controls that was dealt damage. Not only that, but then you have a 2/2 flying lifelinker in play, so you immediately take your turn, untap, and get to swing with the assassin and get 2 life back of the damage you took from their attack last time. So this is a perfect way of just completely mitigating your opponent's aggro plan. Kill their best creature, have a creature in play after they probably spent their mana and can't kill it, and can immediately swing in and get back the 2 life because you have evasion and they probably can't block it. And then you have this clock that's just giving you 2 life and taking 2 from them every turn in the air after that. That just seems like a lot for a common in limited, at least. I think no matter what this does, 4 mana is going to be too much in constructed, but in limited, I think this is probably the best common, honestly. It's just crazy. It just does everything you want to do, and the flash is really what makes it super special. It's really everything put together, but the way the flash glues everything about the card together is what makes it really, really work way better than a card like this typically would work. A lot of times we've seen these types of abilities and they've been on sorcery speed creatures, and that just ain't it, you know? You can only kill things, you know, if they take damage in combat when you're attacking, and they don't help you recover when you're on the defensive. But being able to be the blocker, you're able to make sure the biggest thing that you want to kill is the thing that you chump in that takes the damage so that you can kill it. So yeah, I just think this card is awesome. Very, very high pick in common. Might be the highest pick common, to be completely honest. Next up, we have Rush of Dread. This is another card that was competing for best card. This is 2 black and 1 for a sorcery. It has Spree. For an extra 1 mana, target opponent sacrifices half the creatures they control, rounded up. For an extra 2 mana, target opponent discards half the cards in their hand, rounded up. And for another extra 2 mana, target opponent loses half their life, rounded up. So this card is just kind of bananas for a few different reasons. First of all, it targets an opponent, which means it's going to count as committing a crime. So it's got that extra value just built in. As if this card wasn't good enough, it's going to help you commit crimes just incidentally and get you even more value, which is nice. But the fact that you can get rid of half their board state, rounded up, so if they've got 3 creatures, they have to lose 2 of them and only be left with 1. Or their hand means they're screwed if they do, screwed if they don't. Like, they can't play around it like they normally would a sweeper, right? If they vomit out their whole hand onto the board, you make them sack half their creatures. If they're holding back most of their hand and drip feeding and trying to get you to deal with everything one-on-one, you just make them discard half the cards in their hand, right? And if you have enough mana and they've sort of been doing a little bit of both, you just make them do both. But not only that, you can make them lose half their life, rounded up. So if they're at, like, I don't know, 11, they go to 5. That seems... It's the versatility of getting to use any one of these modes. It's that same value that you have with Charms, and the reason why Charms is so good, combined with just being able to do it all if you have enough mana, which is crazy. But there's a couple of crazy ways you can use this in Constructed. First of all, the one that most people have figured out already, Bloodletter of Apothecary, which at the end of turn makes somebody lose the same amount of life that they've already lost for the whole turn. Whatever amount of life they lose in a turn, Bloodletter of Apothecary makes them lose the same amount. It basically doubles the life loss. So if you play a card like this that makes them lose half their life, rounded up, and then they lose that amount again from the Bloodletter, it's just an auto kill. So Rush of Dread for 5 mana with a Bloodletter of Apothecary out is just an automatic kill. And it might be worth playing with that card because there is a Bloodletter of Apothecary deck right now that's pretty good that uses Mindlink Mech. A buddy of mine, the Orange Crunch, has brewed that one, and I was thinking about brewing something similar, and now this card is really making me think I probably should. So you might see that coming on the channel. But the other way I'm excited to use this, the one that's overlooked, is with the new Jace. And I know we haven't gotten to blue yet in the set review, but I still need to bring this up because it's just that crazy. So the new Jace comes out for only 2 mana, right? It's a 2 blue mana for a Planeswalker. You can only play it on turn 4 or later. You can't play it your first 3 turns. And I'm not going to get into completely what the card does, but one of the things the card does is it allows you to uptick to plot any card from your hand that costs 3 or less. And then on your next turn, you can just play that thing for free if you want. Now, what you can do with something like Rush of Dread, since it is a 3-drop, you can plot the Rush of Dread with Jace's uptick, and then next turn you can play it for free and just pay the additional costs to trigger those abilities. So what it does is give you a 3 mana cost reduction on Rush of Dread, or any of the spree cards that, you know, have a 3 mana base cost. You get to basically get a 3 mana cost reduction. So you could play this on the next turn and just pay 3 mana and make them lose half their creatures and half the cards in their hand. Or just pay 5 mana and make them lose half of everything, right? You could do some crazy stuff way earlier than you should be with that combination. And it's just one of the ways Jace is kind of busted, but super cool way that you can use this card. And I'm really excited to brew that deck. So that's going to be fun. Much more fun than Itchy Noses, that's for sure. Next up, we have Servant of the Stinger. This is actually my pick for best limited card in black. And there's a good reason for this. This is a 1/3 human warlock with 1 black and 1, 4/1 black and 1 with Death Touch. And whenever he deals combat damage to a player, if you've committed a crime this turn, you may sacrifice Servant of the Stinger. If you do, search your library for a card, put it into your hand, and then shuffle. So, why is this guy so good? Well, let's get the obvious stuff out of the way. 1/3 Death Touch can block pretty much anything 2 power or less all day and kill it. It can also block anything huge and trade with it, so it keeps your opponent's stuff from wanting to swing in at you if you need to be on the defensive, because they're going to lose their best guy, right? It's also a human and a warlock, so it's going to count as Outlaw Tribal, which there's a ton of support for, so that is just a really good bonus on this card. But what makes it so good is the fact that you're able to sack it to tutor. That in limited is insane, and at first glance it might seem like it's hard to turn that on, but in reality, I don't think it's going to be that hard. Committing a crime is going to happen very incidentally. If your opponent just doesn't have any creatures out yet, you can literally just target them with anything. Or if they have 1 creature out, you can just use your removal on their creature, swing into their board that's now empty, and then be able to sack this to tutor up your best bomb that you drafted, and you're just going to win. You're just going to win. Now, if they have more creatures than that, what you can do is you can swing in without committing a crime, and your opponent might be hesitant to block because they don't want to lose a big creature and trade with this. And if you haven't committed a crime yet, they might think that, you know, they're fine. You'll just get in for a damage if they let it go through. They don't want to trade with this on the chance that you can't commit a crime, right? So they're going to be very trepidatious about blocking this if you haven't committed a crime. And then what you can do is, after blockers are declared and they're just going to let this through for a measly 1 damage, at instant speed you can use something that commits a crime that targets them, and then you still get to sack it and tutor for a card. So there's some really tricksy stuff you can do by like making your opponent let their guard down, so to speak, and let this come through, because nobody wants to block this. If they block it with something big, they lose a better creature. And in some scenarios, that's better than tutoring, right? But if they block it with something small, they don't kill your servant, and you can just swing in again next turn, so they can't chump block it. So at the very least, they have to block this with something with at least 3 power, but they're almost definitely going to lose something bigger, something that costs them more mana than what this did, if they do that. So it's, no matter what they choose to do, they're going to be in a rough situation, and that's even if they're in the situation where, you know, you can't remove their only blocker or force servant through. Which is plenty of times there's going to be just 1 creature that you kill with removal and this just gets through and there's nothing they can do about it, which is also bananas. So just so much potential to tutor up a card, so much potential to just mess with your opponent's head, have them not know what you're going to do when you're swinging in with this and haven't committed a crime yet. Just a lot you can do here, and I kind of love it. But any kind of tutor that's efficient to use in limited is going to be nuts. So I think this guy is my pick for the best limited card in black. Next up, we have Shoot the Sheriff, which is kind of the opposite. This is 1 black and 1 for an instant. Destroy target non-outlaw creature. Cards like this are going to be really good in older formats, where specific outlaw creatures matter less and less and less, because the card pool is so big that the chances that your opponent has, you know, a relevant amount of outlaws that this won't work against is much lower. So this could be really good instant speed 2-mana removal in older formats, but in newer formats, stuff like Standard and especially Limited, this is not going to be good, man. Outlaws are going to be everywhere. I think this is the worst instant speed removal, like, condition like this that we've gotten in as long as I can remember, because it's not just that it can destroy a non-insert creature type here creature. It can't hit any of 5 creature types, which are the 5 most prevalent creature types in the set. So that's just doubly bad, man. It's going to be really hard for this to hit anything. That being said, pretty decent in the sideboard in Limited. You know, if you know you're up against a deck that isn't really utilizing very many outlaws, they went a different direction with their deck building, this can come in and be really effective creature removal. So you don't want to completely overlook it. It's worth picking up a little bit later in the draft if a copy tables, and just tucking it away into your sideboard so that if you're up against just the right deck, it can just be really, really effective creature removal. Next up, we have Skullduggery. This is just 1 black mana for an instant. Until end of turn, target creature you control gets +1/+1. Target creature an opponent controls gets -1/-1. This is fine. This is a 1 mana thing at instant speed. That's a nice little combat trick. I think most of the time the way this is going to be effective is you wait for them to block, or you block something. You give your creature that's in combat the +1/+1, and their creature that's in combat the -1/-1. And in that way, it can almost be like it's an instant speed 1 mana -2/-2. It effectively does the same thing, and helps you ensure that you kill that thing and your guy survives. But the fact that it's not strictly that it can also be used when you're on the attack, and split the +1/+1 and the -1/-1 to get a little extra value. Maybe your guy that went unblocked gets the +1/+1 so you can get in for a little bit of extra damage. And then the other guy that they blocked, the thing that's blocking gets the -1/-1 because that's just enough for it to die. So it's like a -2/-2 instant speed in combat trick, except with a little bit of upside in that in the right situations you can split the +1/+1 and -1/-1 in a way where you get even more value off of it. So because of that, I think this card's actually a little bit better than it looks. That being said, it is going to be filler removal. It's not going to be a high pick. This is something you try to fill out your removal with, you know, when you get towards the bottom of a pack. But that being said, if you do happen to have a copy, don't overlook it. Give it a second look, because I feel like it's really easy to feel like this does next to nothing at first glance until you realize how you can line things up in combat and make it much more effective. So don't count it out completely, but it's still not going to be a super high pick. Next up, we have Tiny Bones Joins Up. 1 black mana for a legendary enchantment. When it enters the battlefield, any number of target players each discard a card. And whenever a legendary creature enters the battlefield under your control, any number of target players each mill a card and lose a life. This card's kind of awesome. For just 1 mana, you make them discard, and you have a permanent on the battlefield you can do things with, like that Braids deck we mentioned earlier in the video. You have sacrifice fodder for that. But it doesn't stop there, because every time you play a legendary creature, you get to make them lose a life and mill a card. And what's more relevant than that is that counts as committing a crime. When you play Tiny Bones Joins Up and make them discard a card, it targets, so it counts as committing a crime. And then every time you play a legendary creature when this is on the battlefield, it's going to give you a free commit a crime to trigger your synergies. That is what makes it really good. Any ways in this set where you can commit crimes for free without having to spend mana to enable those sorts of payoffs is going to be way better than it looks at first. So if you're in that kind of a deck, this is going to be really good. And if you get this early enough in the draft, you want to greatly consider going into that archetype and keeping it in mind and keeping an eye out for cards that are going to have commit a crime payoffs, because you're going to really be able to snowball that with a card like this as long as you're going high on legendaries. Even if you don't go high into like with a lot of legendaries, being able to trigger this just once or twice over the course of a game and get a few free crimes committed is still enough value to be worth it, when for 1 mana you just made them discard a card anyway, and it's, you know, it's still the same card advantage. So keep that in mind. It can be pretty useful in the right deck. It's definitely going to be a lot more useful in Constructed than in Limited, but it should still see play in the right decks that want to commit crimes in Limited. And in Constructed, I expect there to be decks built around this card, because there's just so many cool legends. Legendary Tribal was already really powerful, and like I said before, the discard for just 1 mana, the synergy with Braids, all that stuff, like, there will be a deck. There will. Next up, we have Tiny Bones himself, the Pickpocket. 1 black mana for a 1/1 legendary skeleton rogue with Death Touch, which is pretty decent on its own right. A 1/1 with Death Touch for 1 is pretty standard, because you can just trade with any creature that's bigger than it, so it's always going to be like somewhat good. But then also, whenever Tiny Bones the Pickpocket deals combat damage to a player, you may cast target non-land permanent card from that player's graveyard, and mana of any type can be spent to cast that spell. So every time he connects, you just get to play stuff out of their graveyard. Like, you have to pay the mana, but you don't have to pay any extra mana. You just pay whatever the spell costs. So it's just insane card advantage if you're getting through. And in order to make sure you don't get through, they're going to have to block and lose whatever creature they block with. So this is almost always going to trade up for something better than it or more expensive than it and give you a tempo advantage, which is really, really important. So don't look at it as, oh, it's never going to get through, because our opponent's just going to block it. There's no way they're going to let it get through. We're never actually going to be able to cast spells. You need to look at it as it's a 1/1 that your opponent's always going to trade a better creature for, no matter what. And on the off chance that they can't, you're going to get value every single turn that they can't deal with it. And when you look at it like that, it looks a lot better. And then obviously, it's a rogue, so it counts as outlaw and outlaw tribal. Skeleton tribal, I think, is going to be a real thing finally when this set releases. We've already got skeleton tribal that we've been rocking in current standard. There's actually a deck tech up on the channel right now called Skelechant, which is a really fun Abzan enchantment skeleton tribal hybrid deck, which is kind of wild. I'm not going to get into it here, but if you're interested in that, check it out, because it's got an 88% win rate, and it's just, that deck's nuts. Everyone seems to love it. But anyway, Skeleton Tribal's coming. Be ready. Next up, we have Treasure Dredger. This is 1 black and 1 for a 2/2 human rogue, so it is an outlaw. You could pay 1 and tap it, and pay a life to make a treasure token. This is actually a very cheap way to ramp. The most important thing about this card is that it is a way for you to color fix if you're not in base green. So if you want to go 3 color outlaws and you don't want to run green, cards like this are going to be really important for helping you to ensure that you can get that splash color online. And then in the process, it'll also help you ramp to bomby threats earlier than you otherwise could have played them. So I actually think this card is really good. I would pick it pretty high. Being able to just make a couple treasures over the course of a couple turns by just, you know, very, very little mana investment and a couple life. And then you could just play out something bomby, even if you don't have the color land for it yet. Seems like it's going to be really good in Limited when you take into account the fact that this is just a fine 2/2 body for 2 that slots into Outlaw Tribal really easily anyway. So pick this kind of high, especially if you're in Outlaw Tribal, especially if you're not playing green. Next up, we have Unfortunate Accident, which my nose feels like today. Whew. 1 black mana for an instant with Spree. For an extra 1 black and 2, you can destroy target creature. For an extra 1, you get to make a 1/1 red mercenary creature token that can tap to make target creature you control get +1/+0 at sorcery speed. This is fine. This is good instant speed 4 mana creature removal. instant speed's important, right? Because you could blow out your opponent in combat. You can do tricks with stuff like that. So instant speed partially makes up for it being a bit expensive at 4 mana, but the versatility of being able to choose the other mode, if you're up against a deck that's really creature light and you just need to apply more pressure, like you've had no problem dealing with their threats and keeping their threats off the board, you have other creature removal cards in your hand, you just need to put board presence on the board and put more pressure on the opponent to win, you just make the mercenary token instead and apply more pressure that way. But then if you have enough mana, you could just do both, right? You could just kill the creature and make some board presence, get a bunch of value. I think something like that in Limited is going to be really powerful, so I think this is actually a pretty high pick. Next up, we have Unscrupulous Contractor. I really like this guy a lot. He's one of one of my favorite uncommon common cards in the set for sure. 1 black and 2 for a 3/2 human assassin. When he enters the battlefield, you may sacrifice a creature. When you do, target player draws 2 cards and loses 2 life, and you can plot it for 1 black and 2. So this is basically just a strictly better Felstinger, because you can plot it, which Felstinger couldn't plot, but also its creature types are much more relevant. You can play this in human tribal, and more importantly, you can play this in outlaw tribal, which is going to be a very, very important part of this card. So, strict upsides there to Felstinger just makes this card pretty nuts. If you're in the assassin, or rather the outlaw tribal deck that's trying to go wide and be like an aristocrat style sacrifice deck that uses that outlaws version of Bastion of Remembrance we talked about a little while ago, this card's going to be an awesome inclusion in that, because it gives you a sacrifice enabler to drain with the new Bastion variant, but also is going to draw you cards, and you have the ability to plot it if you need to. So you can plot it, and then on your next turn play it for 0, have all of your mana up to cast the things that you draw, or if you need to double spell, you can do the plot. There's so many different ways in which you can make plot work for you, and that just makes this card great. And just like the Felstinger, if you get them down to just 2 life, you can just make them draw the cards and lose the life, so that you win the game. So having that versatility is also really nice. I think this card just kind of has everything you want. Like the fact that it's, you know, human tribal, outlaw tribal, can also plot. It's just so much good gravy on a card that was already really good. So I think this is a very high pick, especially in decks where you're going wide rather than tall. Next up, we have Vadmir New Blood. This is 1 black and 1 for a legendary vampire rogue. It's a 2/2, but whenever you commit a crime, you put a +1/+1 counter on Vadmir. The ability triggers only once each turn, though, which is kind of a bummer, but that's also a little bit deceptive, and we'll talk about that in a second. As long as Vadmir has 4 or more +1/+1 counters on it, it gets Menace and Lifelink. So, a couple things I want to note about this guy. First of all, even though it only gets a +1/+1 counter once a turn, you can still trigger it on your opponent's turn, so that you get 2 +1/+1 counters every turn cycle. If you can just commit a crime on your turn and on their turn, you'll get 2 counters every turn cycle, and this guy can get bigger at twice the speed, right? At twice the speed than he seems like he could, with that deceptive sort of wording that says only once a turn. So you want to keep that in mind. So getting him to 4 counters so he could become a 6/6 Menace Lifelink is a little bit easier than it looks, but also you need to keep in mind the fact that he doesn't have to get the counters from committing the crime in order to turn on the Menace and Lifelink. So if you're playing this in a counters matter deck, where you have other ways of putting counters on your creatures, this can probably turn into a big Menace Lifelinking threat a lot easier and a lot sooner. So you have multiple ways to get there, and that also makes it really good. So that, alongside the fact that even once it becomes a 6/6 Menace Lifelinker, it can continue to grow every time you commit a crime. After that, it doesn't just stop when it hits the, you know, becomes a 6/6 Menace Lifelink. Just because Menace and Lifelink turns on at 4 counters doesn't mean it stops growing. It continues to grow after that, get bigger and bigger and bigger. So those are key points to keep in mind when trying to evaluate this card that I think are a little easier to overlook and shouldn't be overlooked, because I think this can be a really, really good creature if it's in the right deck that can build it up quick enough. And some people have pointed out, when I put this up as a spoiler short, I had some people pointing out to me the fact that it's, by the time it's, you know, a 6/6, you could have already played a 6/6 instead. And you're not wrong, but the 6/6 you could have played instead is going to cost you a lot more mana than 2. So the fact that you can play this on 2 and eventually have your 6/6 or bigger menace lifelinker and still only ever paid the 2, so you're using your mana for other things on other turns instead of playing a more expensive 6/6 guy, makes this guy a little bit better than he seems. And the fact that he's also going to be growing a little bit as time goes on his way to get there means he's not just nothing before you could have that 6/6 out, right? He's going to be better than just the 2/2, you know? The turn before he's a 6/6 with Medicine Lifelink, he's probably a 4/4 at least still, which is already really good for a 2-drop. So there's a lot of value along the way, and there's a lot of value in mana that you save that you can dump into other stuff by playing this as your 2-drop. So a lot of little things to keep in mind, but I do think this card is a winner if it can find the right deck to slot into, where you're going to be able to commit crimes consistently, or you're going to be able to just load up on counters really quick. Either one of those types of archetypes in constructed in standard is going to be able to put this guy to really good use. Next up, we have the very last card of the day. Finally, because my nose is so itchy and I just need to take a break, but I want to make sure I get these out to you, so I can't stop, right? This is Vault Plunderer, 1 black and 2 for a 3/1 human rogue. When he enters the battlefield, or I guess when she enters the battlefield, target player draws a card and loses a life. So, a lot of cool little versatility here. A 3/1 for 3 that's going to effectively be able to trade with most other 3-drops is pretty decent when it draws you a card on ETB, right? And it counts as an outlaw, which is super huge and super important as well. But also, if you get them down to 1, you could just target them with the ETB to finish them off, and that's pretty cool. So, I think there's a lot of value to be had with this guy at common. He's still filler. She's still filler. I love the art, by the way. You're not going to want to pick this high, but if you're in Outlaw, Tribal, or if you just want card advantage stapled to your body, which everybody wants that, right? You do a lot worse than to pick this up in the bottom half of your pack and maybe include a copy, possibly even 2, in your deck, especially if you're going Outlaw, Tribal, and it just gives you even more value because of those synergies. Like, this card's going to be great. So, that's it for black. Thank God my nose can't handle anymore. I need to take a break, but let me know in the comments how you're feeling about the set so far, what you think your best card, your favorite card in black is, what the best card in black is. If you agree or disagree with the things that I pointed out, let me know. Also, if you haven't already, please like the video. It does help me a ton. Now I just come off like I'm begging. I don't mean to come off like I'm begging. I always feel like it means more to me than I can make you understand. Because I just put every moment of every day into trying to work this channel as hard as I could, and it just means a lot. But I'm going to shut up. I'm not going to beg. But if you could like the video, it'd be awesome. Subscribe if you're new, because tons of content is on the way. Blue is up next, so look forward to that. My voice needs a break. It's about to go. But thanks for hanging out. We'll be back. Thanks so much for checking out my channel. I'd like to give a huge shout out to all of my patrons over at Patreon. Without you guys, this channel would not be possible, so honestly, thank you from the bottom of my heart for all of your contributions. If you haven't yet, like and subscribe. The more likes we get and the quicker we get them, the bigger this channel will grow and the faster it will grow. I'd love nothing more than this channel to become something very special for you guys, but it's entirely up to you how fast that happens. Also, if you'd like more deck text, that's somewhere over there. And if you'd like to see what else the channel's been up to lately, that's somewhere up that way. Also, subscribe, circle below, do all the things.